because we worry, if I follow this kid's idea, where will it take me, right? Do we have time for this, right? We have so much to cover in so little time. So all these are real tensions that we have to face, and that's what we want to try to explore with you, is how can creativity really exist when it brings with it all these tensions. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a scenario. So we're going to do like a middle school scenario. I taught middle school and I've taught high school. You know, Romeo and Juliet's usually taught 8th grade, 9th grade, somewhere around that time. So we're going to do a little scenario to try to illustrate this. It'll be like a little running scenario as a backdrop. So imagine you're teaching a lesson on Romeo and Juliet, and you ask your students, can anyone apply their personal experiences to Romeo and Juliet to come up with a takeaway message from the play? So we call on Bruce, and Bruce says,
fighting is bad.
Okay, and so it's like, okay, Bruce, thank you. Is there anything more you want to add, Bruce?
No.
Okay, so, we know Bruce. Bruce is, I mean, that's a good message. It's right there. Is it creative? Is there creativity there? Is there creative potential there? Okay, so maybe we call on another student like Kelly, and Kelly says, Kelly, what do you have to say?
Doctors should have neater handwriting.
Doctors should have neater handwriting. Unusual response. We're talking about Romeo and Juliet. You realize that, Kelly?
Yeah. Doctors should have neater handwriting.
Doctors should have neater handwriting. Is that a creative response? Is there creative potential there? Some might say it is creative. Some would say no, it's just unusual. It's off topic. Maybe Kelly says things like this a lot in our class. We all have a Kelly. Maybe we've been Kelly. So we have Bruce and Kelly. You know, we're trying to position them as somewhat opposites, right? One who provides the answer we're looking for, but there's not much else there. One who is way out there. What do we do? What would you do? So at this point, it's going to be kind of rhetorical. What would you do with these two responses? What's your follow-up response?
For either of them. For either of them, Bruce or Kelly.
For either of them. One of my favorite quotes is from Miles Davis, who says, when you play a wrong note in jazz, he's a great jazz musician, so when you play a wrong note in jazz, it's determined whether it's good or bad with the next note you play. And I think that's a really powerful thing to think about as an educator. So when a student provides us with what might seem like a wrong note, we really don't know if it's good or bad, creative or not, unless we know what the next note is. Right? So think about that in the context of Bruce and Kelly a little bit. Okay, so let's return to this, our first question, what is creativity? And we're going to kind of go into what creativity scholars, what we do a lot of work on, how there's kind of a general understanding of what we mean by creativity. And let's see if this kind of helps us position creativity in the classroom. Okay. So here's a couple of our favorite examples. I'll start with this one, James will have back and forth. So this is a worksheet, and I want you just to think about, are these creative responses? This is like an elementary school worksheet where the child has to identify these different shapes, these different quadrilaterals, a rectangle, a rhombus, parallelogram, square. You know, this is definitely Common Core stuff. And so our child Hope is identifying these, naming the quadrilateral. Name the quadrilateral, that's what she's told to do. Bob, Sam, I love Tennyson, Harry, Kate. Is that creative? It's funny. Is it creative? Who knows? All right, so here's another one.
Write an example of a risk.
Right, so maybe you teach the concept risk, ask this child to write an example of risk.
This.
Is that creative? Who knows what that red check mark means?
Right, is it credit or see me after class?
See me after class, right. Here's another one. Hard and soft water. Briefly explain what hard water is. Anyone know what this might be?
Ice.
Ice, yeah. That's a good part. So we've had students like this, right? Okay, here's another one.
So in this one, you are to assume the role of a Chinese immigrant in 1870. Write a letter home describing your experiences.
And the child writes.
Right? Now, there's a wonderful footnote to this.
Yeah, so I showed this slide to my colleague Young Zhao, I used to be at the University of Oregon with him. And I said, is this gibberish or is this actual a narrative? And he's like, yeah, there's actually a story here. So it is kind of responding in Chinese characters. All right, so are these creative? Are these creative?
So consider a couple of potentially creative stories. Once upon a time, there was a boy. The end. Is that creative? How many say yes? Some say yes. A lot will, of course, depend on what you mean by creativity. There are some models that might encompass this, but generally, there's not much new here. Now consider a different creative story. Once upon a time, there was a boy. Meanwhile, the elephant said to the rhubarb, "Make sure the body of John Adams is not decomposing because the fire ants present in the mango supplies are necessary to invade Colombia tomorrow before the marshmallows take charge and invade Portugal." Is that creative?
I have an office next to this guy. Is that creative? How many people would say that's creative? Quite a few?
Now, most creativity researchers, however, would say no. Neither of these were creative. Why? It's not task appropriate. When we define creativity, the idea is that creativity requires originality. It requires that, being new, being novel, being unique. But it can't be gibberish. It can't be random. And we don't mean appropriate like socially appropriate, and you'll see that often with us. But there are some areas where task appropriate is very wide. If I am asked to do a performance art piece at a coffee house, almost anything qualifies as performance art. I can do what I want. If I'm asked to solve the question 5 + 4, there are creative ways I can solve it, but if I write fish, it's not a creative response to that question.
Yeah, I think just to kind of unpack this further, so this is a little notation that we like to use that I think what's really important is this kind of multiplicative function here. So it's originality times task appropriate as defined in the context. So again, if you ask a student to solve a mathematical equation, they write this beautiful sonnet about the beauty of mathematics. In the context of a math exam, that's not creative. And we'll talk about, so what do you do with that? Or if you ask a kid to write a haiku, you've been studying haiku, and they write a beautiful free verse, is it a creative haiku? No, because there are conventions to haiku poetry, right? So part about being creative is knowing what the constraints are. And this is why we heard, for example, thinking outside the box. That's a somewhat problematic concept for creativity because oftentimes you have to be creative inside the box. And you have to understand the box. There's times when you have to know when to develop a new box and to destroy the box. But in many cases, particularly in the classroom, it's really about how do you be original within the constraints. And those constraints come from the academic content we're trying to teach. This is how creativity can actually live in what we're trying to teach, right? We already have this part. It's oftentimes we need to introduce the originality within this context. So the beautiful thing about this notation is if it's original but not appropriate for the task, it's not creative, it's just original.
It's like multiplying anything by 0. It becomes 0.
Exactly, right? And so if it's appropriate but not original, it's still not creative. So what we saw in the initial example is Bruce's comment was task appropriate, not very original, probably not creative. Kelly was original, but it wasn't clear whether she was on task, not creative. But can we do something with those two types of responses? And that's what we would argue, yes, we can do something with that. And by the way, we're open to any questions,
Yeah, questions, thoughts, comments,
concerns,
feedbacks.
bits of rage, whatever you want to share. All right?
Maybe not bits of rage.
Okay, so the idea then is, sometimes we have original expressions that aren't very task appropriate. I remember I had a student teacher once who had a portfolio like this. They had to keep a little teaching portfolio. She had sequence on it. It was beautiful. But inside it was kind of gibberish, right? So you need originality and task appropriateness. That's what creativity is all about. Both those things, it has to meet the requirements of the task. I think this is a really kind of liberating conception of creativity, particularly for teachers who are just living in a world of constraints, time constraints, curricular constraints, right? So it's about how do we introduce originality and still maintain our obligations to meeting the task requirements that we professionally have an obligation to fulfill. Okay, so there's a couple ways to think about creativity. Here's a famous model, the 4 Ps.
And the idea is that it's ways of thinking about creativity. There are 4 Ps, and we're going to go through each of these